Hi, Dave Anderson from the Heart of Heritage Hunt. This is episode 9, part 1 of a 3-part story about the 1st Minnesota Volunteer Infantry during the American Civil War. I wanted to issue this episode before Memorial Day because their bravery and sacrifice embodies all that Memorial Day is about. In part 1, we'll talk about their participation in the First Battle of Manassas and hear a song I wrote about their bravery called Thunder Shook the Hills. In part 2, we'll hear about the fight that made them famous on the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg. And in part 3, we'll hear about their mustering out of the war and also about a walk I took on the Manassas National Battlefields back in 2015. I hope you enjoy and watch all 3 videos and have a great Memorial Day. Hi, this is Dave Anderson, and this is the 1st Minnesota Volunteer Infantry, a story of bravery, heroism, and valor. How many of you know anything about the Civil War? The Battle of Gettysburg, or the infamous Pickett's Charge? Anybody familiar with the 1st Minnesota Volunteer Infantry? Well, I've studied the Civil War for many years, been to Gettysburg countless times, and yet I hadn't heard of the 1st Minnesota Volunteers until I went to a campfire talk put on by Gettysburg Park Rangers back in 2015. Regardless of how you feel about the Civil War, I believe bravery, heroism, and patriotism are something to be revered and remembered. So in the tradition of troubadours, park rangers, and singer-songwriters, I hope you'll indulge me while I tell you the story of the 1st Minnesota Volunteers. In the spring of 1861, Abraham Lincoln called on all states in the Union to form a volunteer army to put down the uprising of southern states that would become the Civil War. Even though they had only become the 32nd state 3 years before, the governor of Minnesota promised 1,000 soldiers for the Union Army. With almost no African Americans or slaves in the entire state, Minnesota still had no problem filling their quota, even though up to that point they were more concerned with Indian raids, as seen in their state flag, than slavery or state rights. But the loggers, trappers, farmers, and their sons who joined wanted to fight for their new country. Enlisted for a 3-year tour in May of 1861, the 1,000 volunteers traveled down the Mississippi and made their way with the other Union soldiers to Washington, D.C. to train and await orders. In July 1861, those orders came to march to a small town of Manassas in Virginia, there to confront the Confederate forces in what became the first major battle of the Civil War. At 2 a.m. the morning of July 21st, they left the town of Centerville and crossed the Bull Run stream at Sudley Ford to finally face the Southern Army. They didn't see much fighting until well after the initial battle began, but eventually faced the enemy on Matthews Hill. Throughout the remainder of the day, Northern troops pushed Southern forces down Matthews Hill and up Henry Hill, where the current Park Visitor Center sits, only to have the South drive them back into the valley and up Matthew Hill in retreat. Back and forth it went throughout the day. On the Henry Hill Ridge, amongst other Southern troops, there were some under the command of General Thomas Jackson. That afternoon, on that ridge, General Jackson got the nickname Stonewall, spreading fear in Union troops throughout the war. Late in the day, the Minnesota Volunteers, along with others, traveled up Henry Hill and crossed right in front of the Southern line, which included Stonewall Jackson's men, at the top of Henry Hill, for a brief time pushing the Southern soldiers back into the brush and woods. The Union troops started cheering and celebrating what they thought was a big victory. What they didn't know was that the South was being reinforced by Confederate troops
who were stationed in the Shenandoah Valley but had been brought into the fight by railroad to Manassas Junction and then up to the battlefield. This was the first use of rail to move troops to an active battle in the history of warfare. As the Northerners cheered, fresh Southern troops streamed over the hill, pushing the Northerners back the way they had come, in full retreat. The Minnesota 1st went down through the valley, up Matthews Hill, and eventually back across Bull Run at Sudley Ford. From there, they made their way back to D.C. to heal their wounds, rebuild their regiment, and train for the next fight. To me, a couple things stand out about their participation in the battle. First, it was the first time bullets had been flying around them, and they saw people they knew killed in battle. It was as horrifying for them as for all other soldiers. Second, their placement in the assault on Henry Hill late in the battle resulted in them being positioned next to artillery cannons. Many of them commented afterwards that it sounded like they were in the middle of a severe lightning storm, with thunder echoing off Matthew and Henry Hills. Third, even though they saw many Northern troops panic and run towards the rear when faced with enemy fire, they stood their ground and followed orders without hesitation. In fact, following the battle, Minnesota volunteers were cited for their bravery and willingness to stand and fight. This bravery, however, resulted in many losses. During their day on the battlefield, the regiment lost 49 killed, 107 wounded, and 34 missing.
I'm going to play a song for you now that I wrote about that battle, from the perspective of a Minnesota soldier who had lived through the fighting and was proud of how they'd fought. It's called Thunder Shook the Hills. The turnpike was dusty, the progress was slow. Beside us rode politicians who looked for a show. Camping short of Manassas, days turned into night. At 2 a.m. one morning, we marched on to the fight. Everyone knew the rebels waited at the stone bridge. But we entered the battle up near Matthew Hill's Ridge. The Confederate force used Henry Hill as a veil. Southern troops in the valley quickly brought in by rail. When thunder shook the hills, we stood our ground, with Jackson at our front, guns and cannons all around. Among the last to leave, blood beneath our feet. We never gave an inch until they called retreat. In reserve we were held, confusion ruling the day. With the dust our command commanders couldn't tell blue from gray. Face to face with the rebels, men we knew fought and died. As the South's reinforcements joined the fray, turned the tide. We learned a lot that day. Every Minnesota son, you have to stand and fight when those around you turn and run. When thunder shook the hills, we stood our ground. With Jackson at our front, guns and cannons all around. Among the last to leave, blood beneath our feet. We never gave an inch until they called retreat. We retraced how we got there and withdrew from the field. Soon the column turned eastward, disappointment concealed. Realizing the struggle would not have a quick end, we retreated to safety, some to drill, some to mend. When thunder shook the hills, we stood our ground. With Jackson at our front, guns and cannons all around. Among the last to leave, blood beneath our feet. We never gave an inch until they called retreat. Until they called retreat. We just